My definition of sustainability, there's nothing magic about it, but it is consistent with many other definitions. And I would say that sustainability is the capacity to maintain or improve the state and availability of desirable conditions or materials over the long term. Sustainability always implies long term. Now, what long term is may vary from 25 years to 300 years to forever, but it's long term. And it's generally oriented toward improving conditions, at least maintaining what we want and hopefully improving beyond that. Now, sustainability as a concept probably dates back to where we first started really getting concerns about human impacts on the environment. So in the late 1700s, with Thomas Malthus, who was concerned with human population growth and the damage that was being seen for him in about 1798, to people like Alexander von Humboldt, Mary Somerville, both of whom were observing human impacts on the environment. Mary Somerville was important in starting people thinking about interactions that we don't always recognize. And George Perkins Marsh, who observed damage to the old world and the new world as an ambassador. Sustainability is related then to ideas of preservation and conservation. In the mid to late 1800s in the United States, we started getting a lot of concern with loss of natural resources, loss of scenery that had been lovely, and scenes that no one had really much access to from Europe, and so we had a different set of resources. Gifford Pinchot was the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service, and he coined the term, or at least made popular the term, conservation. His definition was that conservation is the greatest good for the greatest number over the long term. He also referred to it as wise use of natural resources, and this is really consistent with what we think of as sustainability today, or at least what we think of as environmental sustainability. In the United States, we first had legislation that mentioned sustainability in 1960 with the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act, also oriented toward management of our national forests. It specified that forests should be managed for sustained yield in order to keep the production going well over time. So the idea of sustainability and the concept especially of environmental sustainability has roots in observations of environmental damage. And then we began recognizing not just that the environment was being damaged, but that human well-being was being affected by our effects on the environment. And so we started going through the environmental movement of the 1960s and 70s, where environmental concern really gained traction. And it was helped along by things like astronauts going out away from the Earth and taking photographs of the Earth, showing us that we were on a small, round, blue sphere out in the middle of the darks of space. And so greater concern with this lifeboat Earth, the planet that we only knew one of, got to be stronger and stronger. And we recognized that changes to the environment were happening faster, bigger, more than in the past. So the trends in human impacts on the environment were such that we were changing the number of ways that we affect things. For example, we were inventing new chemicals. We were inventing new ways of doing things. We invented things like chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs. Great thing, CFCs. They made it possible to refrigerate. Okay, made it possible to have air conditioning. Bad thing was that they destroy ozone in the atmosphere. And we didn't recognize that at first. Okay, we invented pesticides, things like DDT. So we began affecting entire food chains. So DDT did what we wanted it to do. It controlled mosquitoes, but it had effects far up the food chain. So we were changing the number of ways that we affect the environment by developing these new technologies. We changed our scale of impacts. Early on in human history, we were located in small areas. Okay? And we basically had effects on just those small areas. As our population grew and people spread globally, and we changed our technologies, the scale of our effects grew to be global rather than just locally around settlements. Okay? The complexity, the magnitude, how big our effects are, and the frequency of our impacts have changed. So early on, people had small effects locally. They weren't too big, and they weren't too often, or they weren't too frequent. Another way that people have changed their effects on the environment is by changing our per capita effects. So per person, we use more than early in human history. So every one of us is responsible for greater use of the environment and what the environment provides. In terms of our shift from local to global scale changes, these take place in two ways. There's systemic change and there's cumulative change. Systemic change is where we are affecting entire systems that are global in scale. The atmosphere, the oceans. Okay, we're affecting the atmosphere through climate change. We're affecting the oceans through the same chemicals that are being released into the atmosphere that create climate change, but in the oceans they create acidification. So the oceans are becoming more acidic. This is referred to as systemic change. We're affecting the entire system. We're also affecting things globally through cumulative change, where we're doing the same thing, but in a lot of different places. So when you total it up, it becomes global. So deforestation happens not in a single global system, but in many, many ecosystems. So that deforestation occurs in South America, in Africa, in Asia. And so globally, we've seen a reduction in forests. Globally, we've seen a shift toward more and more agricultural land. Okay, so not single systems, but many systems that total up to be a global effect. All right, the idea of sustainable development actually really gained attention through the United Nations initiative called the World Commission on Environment and Development. And what happened was that the United Nations decided that there should be a study of people and the environment and our well-being. So putting all of these things together. The report that came out of the World Commission on Environment and Development, WCED, is also known as the Brundtland Report, named for the chairwoman of the commission. Commission is just a big committee. Gro Harlem Brundtland. So the Brundtland Report, the WCED report, or Our Common Future, the name of the report, all the same thing. This came out in 1987 after about 4 years of study. And it gave us what is frequently used as the most common definition, or I'd say description, of sustainable development. It's not really a full definition because it uses development as part of the definition, so it's more of a description. But the Brundtland Report basically tells us that sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Components of sustainability or sustainable development are normally given as environmental sustainability, social sustainability, and economic sustainability. Okay, so these are the parts that build into sustainable development. The problem with sustainable development as a term was, first of all, that people tend to think of development as meaning economic growth, that that's what development means. It wasn't the intent of the Brundtland Report to imply that, though. So, first off, sustainable development was criticized as a concept because it was seen as an oxymoron. Right? An oxymoron is a contradiction in terms, sort of like jumbo shrimp. Okay. So this perception that it meant growth isn't really correct, and we've come to understand that better in the environmental community as well as across the board. So when we see development as meaning an improvement in well-being, not so much of a problem. And that's really what they meant when the WCED came out with the report. So that was the focus, was looking at human well-being and the connections to the well-being of the environment. Okay. For people, this meant improvements in the things that are seen as essential human needs. So meeting needs of people in terms of food availability, water, education, jobs, and also being equitable, so being fair and even-handed across generations or across a single generation, across places. Right? So this type of equity could be considered as both intergenerational equity, fairness, even-handedness across a generation, whether we're talking about people living in North America or Africa. It also is intragenerational equity between generations, so our generation to the next. Okay, and I think I just said those in the opposite way. Intragenerational is within a generation. Intergenerational is between generations. Okay. Under the Brundtland Report, they suggested several things that would be a part of the objectives of real sustainable development. Again, meaning well-being as development. So changing the quality of growth, not just thinking about growth for growth's sake, but if growth is happening, changing the focus to quality rather than quantity. Meeting essential needs, meeting those needs for jobs, food, education, water, housing, energy. Ensuring a sustainable level of population. The Brundtland Report came out at a time when there was still a great deal of concern about human population growth. There still is, although that concern has been reduced somewhat because population is beginning to level off globally. We're still looking at 9 billion people on the planet in the next 30 years or so. 10 billion during this century. So it's still growth, but the idea is to make sure that the population is in sync with what the planet can support. Okay. Another of the goals of sustainable development is to conserve and enhance the natural resource base. So to take care of the environment, of the resources that support human life and well-being. Reorienting technology and managing risk. Okay. Why? Well, because by the 1980s we were figuring out that a lot of our technologies had negative side effects. That they did what we intended, but they did a lot besides that. And so there's a need to shift our viewpoint of technology to something where we don't automatically adopt it just because we can do it. But we understand it better and how it fits with our environment so that we're not causing damage. Creating technologies that basically, truly help in terms of well-being. And merging the environment and economics in decision-making. Okay? Our tendency, society-wide, up to this point, has been to base decisions on economics in terms of costs and benefits dollar-wise. So how much does it cost? How much profit do we gain? Rather than basing our decisions strictly on the economics of something, we need to consider environmental aspects and whether we're causing environmental damage. That maybe we don't have a good dollar value to put on it, but we need to consider that as a part of our decision making. So not just the easy part where we've got everything in one unit, dollars or euros or yen or yuan, but we consider things beyond that. Okay, so as I mentioned, there are three basic components that are generally considered to be part of sustainability. Environment, society, and economy. And they're usually shown like this. Basic Venn diagram, 3 circles, they overlap. These are also the considerations when people talk about a triple bottom line approach to decision making. So again, considering not just economic measurements, but also measurements related to social well-being and to environmental quality. Right? The problem with this particular diagram, from my perspective, is that it implies that these things are separate. They just overlap a little bit. We could pull each one out and they could overlap a little bit less. I think it's important to realize that these things are embedded in each other. That the economy is really part of society. We don't talk about economics apart from human beings. Right? There's no such thing as a deer economy or an oak economy. So when we're talking about economics, it's a social thing. It's part of society. Okay? Then we've got society. The economy is embedded in society. It's part of society. Society depends on the environment. So human beings wouldn't exist if we didn't have an environment that provides for us with natural resources and with ecosystem services. All of these things are interacting, but there's a little bit different way of looking at things when you look at dependencies. And we should really look at the dependencies and the relationships more. So this is a way that we can look at components of sustainability. It's also a way we could look at the parts of a place. Okay, we can diagram Manhattan and Riley County in this way. We could look at the state this way. We could look at different countries this way, all of them being social ecological systems. So society, including economics, connected to the environment. When we consider sustainability, we need to consider systems and interactions. Okay, so interacting systems, interacting parts of systems. Here I've just shown interacting parts of system. Okay, here's a single system, state of Kansas. We've got an economic part of the state of Kansas, we've got a social part, and we've got the environment. Right, all interacting, all connected. We could also say that different systems, like the state of Kansas, is connected to other systems. It's connected to Nebraska. Or if you don't like Nebraska so well, it's connected to Missouri. All right? We can look at social economic systems as being interconnected in broader ways. If I wanted to, I can't really do this, but if I wanted to, it might be better if I did this with multiple systems, but I can't do something that is almost infinite in terms of the variety of interconnected systems. But they're linked. They're interacting. This system over here is much more urban than this one. There's less of the environment and a lot more of society in this space. So we can consider things in various models. Okay, now following up on our common future was a report done by the National Academy of Sciences, the National Research Council of the United States. This was a follow-up to our common future. Our common journey looked at the status of where we were in terms of sustainability and some of the other considerations we need to include. Right? So the primary goals, they said, of a transition towards sustainability, and they focused on it as being a transition, not an endpoint. Okay? We're not going to know when we get to sustainability. We're just going to keep trying to move toward it. But the primary goals of this transition should be to meet the needs of a much larger but stabilizing human population. So recognition, when this was written in 1999, about 10 years after the Brundtland Report, the population was stabilizing, but it's still going to be bigger, right? And we need to meet the needs of all of these humans on the planet. Another goal should be to sustain the life support systems of the planet. Okay? We're not going to meet the needs of people unless we sustain life support systems, unless we sustain the environment and ecosystem services. And then the third goal should be substantially to reduce hunger and poverty. This is, again, one of those goals that's oriented toward equity. Intergenerational and intragenerational. So our common journey focuses on different things that we can emphasize for sustainable development. And the report writers talked about this as being what's to be sustained. Okay, so what is it that we're trying to maintain to improve? Okay, what's to be developed? Okay, how do we increase well-being in certain areas? The links between these things, and how do we weight our decisions? Okay, what's going to get the most emphasis in terms of what we're sustaining and what we're developing? And the time frame. What's the extent of the future we're considering anytime we're trying to make decisions and move toward greater sustainability? So when they talked about the kinds of different things to emphasize for sustaining, they were talking mostly about environmental aspects. Nature, life support systems, which includes natural resources, but also sustaining socially community. So there's a social aspect here that should be sustained as well. The connections between people. And then the emphasis on what is to be developed include people, okay, provision of those things that people need, education, an ability to have a job, to be employed, to support one's family, the economy, and society in general. So these were the things they saw as being more of a focal area for development or improved, enhanced well-being. In terms of choices, the choices include the period of time, whether it's 25 years, now and into the future, forever, the next 100 years, the next 300 years, some sort of time frame. Another choice has to do with focus. Are we going to sustain biodiversity mostly, but also develop wealth? How do we do this? So there are different ways to connect the things that get sustained, the things that get developed. And also what they didn't mention is that we also have to consider scale, right? Where are we sustaining certain things? Where are we developing certain things? Is it local? Is it global? Is it in a specific place or region? Okay. So one thing I would observe is that we can't sustain everything everywhere forever. Can't do it. Look at that big list of things that the NRC had. Not a choice to have everything stay exactly the same forever. Things change. And we have limits, as well as a growing human population. So we've got to make choices. Since we have to make choices, that means that sustainability is what we call normative. Normative means that we're making value judgments. We're judging what's good or bad, or we're judging what's better or worse. And so our choices are hopefully being made based on a good set of values and what's best. Science plays a role. It's not all us just deciding things, but we need science to tell us what's possible. We need science to tell us how things work. So to give us some limits that we have to consider with our choices. All right, so the Earth is a closed system. By this point in time, you probably all realize Earth is a closed system. As far as getting more material in or more material leaving the Earth, it's probably pretty even with the occasional meteorite coming in and the occasional spacecraft going out that doesn't come back. Essentially, we're not getting any more. Not getting any more matter. So we've got to deal with what we've got. So there are limits. There are limits on what we have. We can extend the use of things by activities like recycling. So some things can be recycled, not everything. At least not everything in terms of our abilities. There are also limits on ecosystem services, on the ability of the planet to do things for us. Besides providing the natural resources, there are limits on how much waste can be absorbed without damage. Like there's limits on how much carbon the atmosphere can absorb without damage. There are limits on how much carbon the oceans can absorb without damage. And we're running up against that limit. Okay? So we can't sustain everything everywhere forever. Sustainability is normative. We've got to make decisions based on what we want, but we should use science to guide us, right? Based on all of this, we know that our choices are going to matter. Our choices will affect what we sustain and what we develop, or what is sustainable and what is developable. Time frames matter. We can sustain a lot of things for a very short period of time. Maybe we can sustain most things for the next 10 years. The next 50 years, maybe not. We need to approach sustainability from a systems perspective. Okay, the systems that we consider are interconnected. Globally, we've got one big system, the Earth, with its atmosphere and oceans, with the biosphere. Okay, but each part of the Earth is connected to other parts. Each of those spheres, the atmosphere, the biosphere, the hydrosphere, are interconnected as well. The dependence of one system on another varies, and especially varies with scale. How big of an area are we looking at? Okay, the things that affect how a system operates, its structure and function, what makes up the system, and the way those things work with each other, that's important as we make decisions to try to increase sustainability, to move toward that sustainability transition. Direct and indirect drivers of change are both important as we are considering our options. What this means is that as things change, there are some things that we can identify easily. Those are direct drivers. Okay? Deforestation, direct driver, clearing for agriculture. Okay, so as we're clearing stuff for agriculture, we are directly affecting the forest that exists. Okay, so clearing for agriculture is a direct driver. An indirect driver is a reason for clearing for agriculture. That might be population growth. We need more agriculture in order to support more people. Sometimes it's harder to identify the indirect drivers, but we need to understand what is underlying the changes that occur. So we need interdisciplinary understandings, which is part of the reason why this course tries to put together into groups with different backgrounds, because you understand things from different perspectives. You know different things about your surroundings, about the system you're concerned with. Scale matters. Place matters. Okay? The interactions that happen at a different scale are going to be variable. Places are different. Okay, if we're concerned with Kansas, that's a lot different than considering a part of the Amazon basin. So places are different. Place matters. Global changes are essential considerations for sustainability because things are interconnected. Okay? Because we have change occurring through the atmosphere, through the whole system. We need to be considering those kinds of changes when we look at the sustainability status of a small place. Things don't happen all by themselves. They're connected. And then sustainability is connected to resiliency. Resiliency is the capacity to maintain a system's basic structure and function, even when there's a disruption to the system. Okay, for it to keep working in the same way. If it's not resilient, it's likely to totally change So we change from one kind of system, grassland, to desert. If we are in a system that's not resilient and we push it too far, we push it over a threshold. Okay. Adaptability, adaptive capacity, vulnerability are all things that are related to resilience and to sustainability. Okay. A problem with sustainability and sustainable development is that these are fuzzy terms. Okay. People use them in all sorts of ways. We can talk about, well, I've run into a lot of references to sustainable marketing. Okay, sustainable real estate, sustainable other things that you don't necessarily off the bat think of as being a core part of sustainability. So people apply the terms, sometimes misuse the terms in a variety of ways. Doesn't mean that it's useless to consider sustainability. What you need to do is keep some sort of meaning in mind that really is meaningful for the future. Okay, so recognize that people use the term in a variety of ways and abuse the term in a variety of ways. You need to also be aware that perceptions matter. What somebody sees as sustainable or as important for sustainability may not fit with science, may not fit with the knowledge or the perception of other people. So again, you've got to understand what's underlying everything in order for it to be meaningful. Another thing to remember is that sustainability in general, but especially the idea of sustainable development, is people-oriented. Okay? It's very utilitarian. It's managing things in order to have people living good lives as well as we can. But people depend on the environment. And so we can't just orient everything toward making good lives for people without keeping in mind how much we depend on our surroundings, on ecosystems, natural and modified, on our environment. And so we need scientific studies, we need science to help guide us, to let us know what's possible, to let us know how things affect each other in order to make good normative decisions. Okay. Also remember that we can have more or less sustainability depending on what we're looking at and where we are. Sustainability isn't this nice, smooth ramp that we can move up and know that we're getting closer and closer to, ta-da, a sustainable state. Okay, there are different possibilities for any place and different possible things to sustain. We know that most systems have thresholds, that sudden changes are possible. So we're not going to be looking at sustainability as this nice, smooth continuum. We have to consider other possibilities and try to maintain things, if we want them, in a current state without going over a threshold into a different state. Because negative conditions can also be sustainable. It's not the goal. They can be resilient. They can remain in place even though they're not what we want. So, transitions towards sustainability are sort of the key way of looking at sustainability today under our Common Journeys outlook. We won't be able to identify it when we reach sustainability. We won't know. it's going to take time. It's going to take a long period of time to know if things are indeed sustainable and resilient and will stay the way we have them. So we have to follow an adaptive pathway. We have to adjust to changes that occur and to new knowledge. So, I moved along quite fast. Back to the definition. Remembering that sustainability is the capacity to maintain or improve the quality or the state and availability of desirable materials and conditions over the long term. Greater sustainability of any part of the system, whether we're talking about natural resources or a specific natural resource, or the way people are living. Any of that will involve linking our concerns about it with normative priorities, okay, what we want, our choices, combined with what science tells us about how systems work. And so we want to maintain the earth, the blue marble, as best we can into the future for human life, or we've got some real problems. Okay. Any questions? Any questions or comments? You can make observations and tell me I'm all wrong about something if you want to.
Please free to ask questions. Questions from this lecture will be there for your exam one.
I sense that it's nap time.
If you don't have questions, try applying this concept for your projects. And you can ask questions regarding that, right?
Oh, certainly.
Otherwise, we ask questions.
Okay, lunchtime or nap time, whichever is your preference.